There are 18 poems in the WJEC Eduqas poetry anthology. You know, this lovely green book that you all absolutely adore. Well, you don't just need to know all of those 18 poems, you need to be able to compare them too. Well, in this video up here, I discussed the first 6 poems in the anthology and thought about what each one of them might compare to. And in this video here, I did the next 6 poems, and again discussed how they might compare to the poems in the anthology more generally. Well, those videos, get rid of them for now, because in this video we're going to discuss the final 6 poems in the WJEC Eduqas Poetry Anthology. So, what might they compare to? Let's find out. What's occurring, Revision Squad? It's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video I will wrap up my mini-series about comparing the poems contained in the WJEC Eduqas Poetry Anthology. Of course, in parts 1 and 2, which I mentioned just a moment ago in the video intro, I covered how you might compare the first 12 poems in the anthology. Now it's time to look over the final 6, which I hope helps you out with your revision. So why not grab a pen and some paper so that you can make notes of the things I say, and why not drop this video a like too? It helps me out loads and I really do appreciate it. Okay, so the first poem we're going to discuss in this video is John Keats's To Autumn. Which poems could we compare it to? Well, you could compare it to Seamus Heaney's Death of a Naturalist. I actually covered that comparison in the second part of this mini-series, so make sure you've watched that video as well as this one. Now, if you'd rather compare To Autumn to something else, why not consider comparing it to The Prelude? Funnily enough, comparing To Autumn with The Prelude is very similar to comparing To Autumn with Death of a Naturalist. Maybe that's a hint that The Prelude and Death of a Naturalist are very similar. Anyway, let's get back to Autumn and The Prelude. Both are image-heavy nature poems. Keats's poem is practically bursting with images of nature, those fruits and vegetables and bugs and birds and so on. Wordsworth's poem is likewise full of nature imagery, although this is slightly more skewed towards the landscape. Such detail is indicative of the deep fascination that the persona of each poem has for nature. Another point of comparison is that both poems do not hide the violence embedded in man and nature's interactions. To Autumn clearly depicts man slaying nature. I mean, that is the point of harvest after all. Wordsworth also alludes to the violence embedded in man and nature's interactions by mentioning the resounding horn, the pack loud bellowing and the hunted hare, by which he means hunting. Because both poets acknowledge the violence embedded here, you could argue that they depict a more realistic or honest or natural aspect to these interactions. They are showing man and nature's relationship as it really is. However, although these interactions might seem realistic or honest, Keats and Wordsworth present contrasting sides to man and nature's relationship. The relationship is harmonious, supportive and appreciative in To Autumn. Man and nature work side by side in relative peace, and the devotional element of the ode form provides a sense of appreciation. Contrastingly, although Wordsworth's poem depicts children playing in nature, there seems to be something a bit off with their relationship with it, given that nature's response to the sounds they make profoundly alienates the poem's persona. In one poem then, nature supports, but in the other, it disturbs. On a similar note, the presentation of time differs in these poems too. Time has a positive presentation in To Autumn. The personification of the titular season is favourable. Its end is mourned for, but the poem provides hope in suggesting that it will return. On the other hand, the passing of time is negative in the prelude, as the persona's childhood and associated innocence and glee seems to have come to an end, and in growing up they have appeared to have lost their adoration of nature. This loss or death is another place where these two poems differ, as the metaphorical death of innocence is depicted unfavourably in the prelude, whereas nature's sacrifice is revered in Keats's poem. Finally, we could think about structure as well. To Autumn has that rigid ode form, whereas the prelude seems to follow no strict structure. What could we say about that? Well, I suggest that the rigidness and order of To Autumn reflects man's superiority over nature, whereas the prelude's structure, its wildness if you like, creates the impression that man can never fully control the natural world. So now we turn our attention to Philip Larkin's poem Afternoons. Which poems compare nicely with it? Well, William Blake's London compares in an interesting way, but you would know that already if you've seen part 1 of this mini-series, so I'm not going to cover it in detail again for you. A comparison including this poem that I have not yet discussed is how Afternoons compares with Rita Dove's Cosy Apologia. Interestingly, although these poems deal with some similar ideas, they seem to present near opposite views on them. The depiction of married life is a particularly notable idea that these poems offer opposing views of. You see, in Afternoons, Larkin presents married life in a negative way. This depiction is created by a number of things. A critical tone is evoked through a number of words and phrases, such as behind them at intervals, implying that the husbands and wives are not fully unified. They do not stand together, but apart. The image of the wedding album lying near the television also suggests that this intense love has faded into the background. As for rhyme, well, there isn't really any strong rhyme in this poem. I'm going to explain why I've mentioned this in just a moment. Anyway, let's now think about Cosy Apologia instead. A very positive, romantic and romanticised depiction of married love is apparent in this poem. The use of pronouns is incredibly intimate. The cliched image of a knight on a horse is stereotypically romantic, and the strong rhymes in this poem could be compared to a love song. Certainly, I think there's something inherently romantic about rhyme. Okay, so now we're thinking about rhyme again, and I mentioned earlier that there is none in Afternoons. Well, if you agree that rhyme is inherently romantic, that it evokes love songs and, I don't know, Valentine's cards and whatnot, then its absence in Larkin's poem could indicate the opposite. That sense of love is not evoked. These opposing depictions of love ties in very strongly with the contexts of each poem. Think about each poet's life and how this might relate to their views on marriage. Are you seeing any connections? If you've got no idea what I'm going on about, go back and watch my videos for these two poems, and it should become much, much clearer. Right, let's think about Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est for a bit. Which poems could we choose to compare it to? Well, to start off, you might want to think about comparing it, or really just massively contrasting it, with Rupert Brooke's poem The Soldier. I've discussed this pairing in quite some detail already in part 1 of this mini-series, so make sure you've checked it out. Just because Dulce and The Soldier contrast really well, that doesn't mean that you have to stick to comparing those two poems. For instance, why not think about comparing Dulce with Mametz Wood by Owen Shears? Obviously, they are both war poems, although you could say that Dulce is about a lived experience of war, whereas Mametz treats war as a historical event. Both poems use imagery to present soldiers as fragile. For instance, in Dulce, Owen compares the soldiers to old beggars and hags, which are both a far cry from the stereotypically youthful and masculine image that we often have of soldiers, certainly in World War I at least. Likewise, Shears compares soldiers to tiny broken things, like a broken bird's egg. It appears that both poets want to challenge romanticised notions of war and present it more realistically, as gruesome, dangerous and horrifying, as something that ultimately will kill you. These more realistic depictions of war lend themselves to the creation of a negative tone in each poem. This tone is seen throughout both poems, but there is a phrase in each that really stands out to me. The old lie stands out to me in Dulce, as Owen is actively rejecting the notion that it is honourable to die for one's country, and instead he presents it as brutal and unnecessary. Whereas the especially negative phrase comes at the end of Owen's poem, it comes right at the start of Shears's, in which he calls the fallen soldiers the wasted young. Here, Shears appears to be criticising war itself, as he implies that the loss of these soldiers' lives, and therefore the thing that caused that, war itself, was totally unnecessary. A considerable distinction between these two poems can be found in their perspectives. Having fought in battle himself, Wilfred Owen was able to accurately depict the horrors of frontline battle. Shears, on the other hand, he's a contemporary poet who has never fought in war, and certainly not in World War I, and so he is only able to convincingly write from the perspective of an observer years later. The use of pronouns in these poems evidence this, as Owen uses the first person plural we, and Shears instead uses the more distant third person plural them. The effect of this is that in Dulce, Wilfred Owen is able to accurately depict the atrocities of war in order to challenge the way that it was perceived back home during World War I, whereas Shears, a proud Welshman, is able to remember and respect a group of Welsh soldiers who history might have otherwise forgotten. Structurally, these poems differ too. Dulce features alternate rhyme and lines of 10 syllables, but has no consistent stanza length. Mametz features no consistent rhyme or line length, but each stanza is 3 lines long. What could that represent? Well, I argue that the inconsistent stanza length in Dulce mimics the unpredictability of war, and that whilst the soldiers can march using that consistent rhythm, as sort of implied by the alternate rhyme, war's power will always disrupt this and break them up. The lack of rhyme scheme and consistent line length in Mametz Wood could represent nature and the landscape. The form of the poem, after all, is a bit more organic and uncontrolled. This might make sense, given the poem's slight focus on the natural world. The regular stanza length could suggest that things have settled down and that the chaos of war is but a distant memory. Alright, that was a lengthy comparison, I know, but I hope you found it useful. Ozymandias is probably my favourite poem in the entire anthology, but knowing about this poem on its own isn't good enough. I need to know which poems I could compare it to as well. So, which poems could I compare it to? Well, I could compare it to Ted Hughes's Hawk Roosting, also known as my absolute favourite possible comparison in this entire anthology. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've already discussed that in detail in part 2 of this mini-series, so make sure you've watched that video to hear me explain just why I love this comparison so much. If, for some reason, you're not so keen on that comparison, why not then instead compare Ozymandias with The Soldier by Rupert Brooke? It's a bit of a strange comparison, I know, but hear me out. Something that really stands out to me is that both of these poems use the sonnet form, despite not being what you might typically expect when you think of love poetry. But in a way, these are kind of love poems. I'll discuss that in just a bit. You could also comment on the presentation of nature in these two poems as well. By the end of Ozymandias, the lone and level sands are shown to outlast man's creations, suggesting that nature is more powerful than man. A similar idea is alluded to in The Soldier, in which nature, or more specifically the English countryside, is shown to carry on even if the soldier cannot. In both poems, nature is a constant, and man, his existence is fleeting in comparison. Anyway, let's get back to thinking about love. We've already decided that both poems are love poems in a sense, but which types of love do they depict? I think that Ozymandias' persona is incredibly arrogant, calling himself the King of Kings and whatnot. And this could be seen as Ozymandias valuing himself more highly than anything else in the world, also known maybe as arrogance, which could be seen as a type of self-love. The love depicted in The Soldier is more nationalistic. The soldier persona appears to be incredibly proud to be English and will apparently do anything to protect and honour England. Now, neither of these types of love are what you might expect when thinking about a love poem, and yet both poets seem to have successfully created more alternative love poems. Shelley's poem seems to warn against excessive self-love, whereas Brooks celebrates nationalistic pride. Why do you think they wanted to achieve those particular effects? These forms of love also have a bearing on the references to religion that are made in each poem. Ozymandias' excessive pride makes him believe that he is greater than God, whereas the soldier's immense nationalistic pride makes them see England as a utopian, Eden-like heavenly space. And now it's time for the penultimate poem in the anthology, Mametz Wood by Owen Dulce. Which poems might you compare it to? Well, you could consider comparing it to Dulce et Decorum Est, which I discussed only moments earlier. Or you could instead compare it to Rupert Brooke's poem, The Soldier, which I feel like I've been saying a lot in this video. Turns out Brooke's poem compares nicely with the war poems at the end of the anthology. How surprising! So yeah, both Mametz Wood and The Soldier are war poems that depict soldiers. Great. Not the most exciting or insightful comparison to make, I must admit. But we'll be able to make it a bit more interesting in just a moment when we think about how these poems might contrast. Both poems also acknowledge death. That being a soldier means that you are risking your life. Although we're starting to drift into how these poems differ once again, I would like to point out that dying in battle is presented as honourable in The Soldier, whereas it is shown to be a bit pointless in Mametz Wood, as seen in the quotation, "the wasted young." Land is also personified in both poems, which I think is an interesting technique for the poets to use. In Mametz Wood, the earth stands sentinel, meaning that it is watching, guarding and protecting, much like a soldier would. In The Soldier, land is personified as a woman, possibly a mother, given that it bore, shaped and made aware the soldier. In both cases, I would argue that this shows that soldiers and the land are unified and that they work together. A positive relationship between man and nature is shown. Could this positive relationship even suggest that the earth itself is encouraging British soldiers? That the earth itself is on Britain's side? Does it mean that it is natural for Britain to win in battle? Possibly. Anyway, I promised I would make the comparison that these are both war poems more interesting. So here we go. Mametz Wood has a realistic depiction of war because it is brutal, whereas The Soldier is much more romanticised and is very optimistic and almost ignorant. What do these opposing depictions hinge upon? The answer is the knowledge of war that the poets had. Take Mametz Wood. Owen Shears wrote this poem in the 21st century. The horrors of World War I and World War II, as well as the countless other wars that have occurred in the 20th and 21st centuries, are unfortunately well known these days. As such, Shears was able to draw upon this knowledge to write his poem, using history to his advantage to criticise the unnecessary losses of World War I, and perhaps all wars beyond it too. Compare this to Brooke's poem. A young man in the early 20th century, Rupert Brooke did not necessarily know what he was signing himself up for when he decided to become a soldier. World War I was, after all, the first major global conflict. Nothing else had matched its scale previously. Furthermore, propaganda abounded that masked the realities of war, and so Brooke was almost definitely going to be oblivious about what war was really going to be like. Perhaps he fell foul of the propaganda, or even decided to add to it, and so his depiction of war and dying in battle is almost like a fairy tale or Disney movie. It's all sunshine and rainbows. It's not realistic, but Brooke didn't necessarily know what the reality was. Just to wrap this comparison up, I wanted to quickly make a comment about form, which ties in with what I've just been discussing quite well. Mametz Wood is an elegy, a mournful form of literature that often remembers the dead. The Soldier, as I've said loads of times already, is a sonnet. These two forms are intrinsically different. One is sad, the other optimistic. Again, I think this must come down to the levels of knowledge that the two poets had of war. I imagine it would be super difficult to write a genuinely optimistic and positive war poem these days. And finally, we have the excerpt from The Prelude, which for the WJEC or Eduqas exam board is the ice skating scene. Nice and easy this one. Are you ready to see which comparisons you could make? Well, you could compare it to Death of a Naturalist. This comparison is great, as the poems are similar enough so that you could make some very straightforward comparisons if you're looking to get your GCSE English pass. But they're also complex enough to warrant some very deep, insightful and interesting connections too. Watch the second part of this mini-series to get my full explanation of this possible comparison. Another poem you could choose to compare the Prelude with is To Autumn, which I discussed at the beginning of this video. And that actually brings this video full circle, and also wraps up our discussion of the comparisons you can make across this anthology too. Lovely stuff. Alright, there we go. The comparisons you might make with the final 6 poems of the anthology have been discussed. I really do hope that this video and the mini-series as a whole has helped you out with your GCSE English. If it has helped you out, please do let me know. Drop it a like, leave a comment, subscribe, that sort of thing. And yeah, sorry for the YouTuber cringe. If you have any questions or any ideas of your own, I would love to see them and welcome them down in the comment section too. I'm usually pretty good at replying as well, and people seem to find my responses helpful, so go wild. As ever, I hope you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are revising, please do remember to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be. Right, well with that video, that is all 18 poems in the WJEC Eduqas Poetry Anthology discussed, as well as the possible comparisons you could make between them. As ever, have an awesome rest of the day. Cheers.